Welcome to another episode of Cadence Fishing TV, and in this video I'm going to take you through the floats and rigs that I use when I'm pole fishing on rivers. A bit like the running line series that we did for float fishing on rivers, I'm going to consolidate my float patterns down as best as I can. And this is something that I did a few years ago and I think it's really helped me with my fishing. It means that when I'm fishing in a certain situation, for a certain rig, a certain bait, for a certain venue, I know what I'm doing with the rig. Everything's very simple and I can just concentrate on fishing the match. So the floats that I'm going to show you today are from the Edge Tackle range, the natural range that I helped to develop with Richard. And really, these 6 different floats, different families of floats, cover the majority of my pole fishing on rivers, and actually cross over a lot to my lake fishing as well. But we're going to focus on rivers today, and I'm going to take you through each pattern and explain what we developed the float for, the type of rigs, the lines, the hooks and the elastics, make it very clear to understand how to set these floats up in what I think is a perfect way. So first up, we're going to look at the N1 series of floats. So the N1 series of edge tackle floats comprises of 4 different sizes. You can see there from a 0.2, we've got a 0.3, a 0.4 and a 0.5. And these floats are all created using a 1mm solid plastic tip. And also we've got a 0.6mm titanium stem. This pattern of float is one of my favourite types of floats for a lot of river pole situations. I love it when I'm fishing baits on the drop, fishing up in the water or fishing at dead depth but allowing the rig to have a lovely slow fall, sort of mimicking the bait that I'm feeding, so maggots, casters, hemp. And it's kind of a finesse type float. Obviously it's got a slimmer tip, a 1mm tip, and it's quite light in its capacity. So I've set one rig up, which I'll show you, and again, like the pattern of float, this is the type of rig that I tend to use on nearly all river venues that I fish. This particular rig I've set up on the top 5 of my CP2000 pole, and you can see that in this case I've actually used style leads to shot the float. Now I'm perhaps a bit old school when it comes to using styles. I don't think people really use styles so much nowadays, but for me there's no better presentation for fishing on the drop than using style rigs like this. You can see in this situation I've actually spread the styles out in the bottom half of the rig, and I've got a nice long fine hook length. So this is the sort of rig that I'll use when I'm fishing on slow to medium pace rivers, perhaps like the Warwickshire Avon, some stretches of the Trent like round Burton, and also on rivers like the Don and the Calder, where I'm fishing for roach and dace, perch and even chub. So I think I'll take you through the actual rig construction in terms of the line and the elastic, and explain a bit more about the rig. So the elastic I'm using is the Edge Tackle 3 to 4 hybrid elastic. It's absolutely beautiful elastic when you're fishing finer gear like I am in this situation. I've got the elastic through the tip section, the top 2 of my pole, so it's not a long section of elastic. It gives me enough cushion on the strike, but it's also quite positive in terms of swinging the fish in. So from catching lots of fish like roach and dace quite quickly, it's a beautiful elastic to enable me to swing them in efficiently and quickly. So the main line I've used on this rig is 010 Premium Mono. Now 010 seems quite fine, I think, really, to a lot of people, but what I want to do is I want to balance the tackle with all my rigs. So I want to balance the main line to the hook length, and the situation, the size of the float that I'm using. So in general terms, I'd be using 0.10 millimeter to perhaps 0.12 millimeter main line with this type of float, the N1 float, and I'd be using hook lengths from as low as 0.06 millimeter up to about 0.09 millimeter. Just to reference that, I do like using the edge tackle fluorocarbon. So 0.08 millimeter is probably the most used hook length for me on this type of rig. But again, I will go down to 0.06 and up to about 0.09 millimeter in both fluorocarbon and the premium mono. So the great thing with this rig is you'll notice that I've actually got quite a long line. When I'm fishing on rivers, I like to use a long length of line. So for the most part, I make all my rigs up on a top 5, and in some situations I'll even use it on a top 6, even with a light float like this. Especially I'm fishing a pacier peg, perhaps on somewhere like the Upper Trent, where I've got to get my float to run through efficiently and quickly when it's pacey. And I love fishing like that with a long line. I think, for one, it enables me to present my bait and fish it very effectively through with the feed, but also it keeps the pole tip away from the float if I'm fishing in very clear conditions and shallow water. So I just think I'll show you two sort of shotting patterns that I'd use with this N1 float. So I mentioned about the fact that I've got the styles in this situation spread out. The actual styles I've used are number 9 styles. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 number 9 styles, and then 3 number 8 styles. And this is actually our 0.2 float. So it's a beautifully light float, and with that kind of pattern, shotting pattern, I can really make the bait fall so naturally. Another advantage for me for using styles over shot if I'm fishing hemp is I don't get so many shot bites. I think a lot of the times when you're missing bites on hemp, the fish are actually taking the shot, and I find I get less shot bites with styles. So I'm just going to quickly show you another shotting pattern which is a bit more positive, but one that I use a lot. Even perhaps when I'm hemp fishing, if I'm catching a lot of fish on hemp, I want to make the rig more positive. So what I'll do is I'll form a bulk of styles like this. My preference is to actually space them out slightly. Not sure if you can see that, but I've got probably a centimetre gap between each style to create a bulk, and then I'm just going to put the 3 number 7s as droppers below that. So let's get that right. So I think you can see that I've created a spread bolt there, and I've got 3 droppers. So what that's doing is it's getting the bait down quicker to the feeding zone, and I've got the lovely nice fall at the bottom. So on a more positive day, that's definitely the type of rig I prefer to use. And the great thing is in that situation, if I want to shallow up, I can just shallow my float. Obviously keep in touch with the fish. If they go deeper, I can go deeper again without having to worry about anything in the bottom sort of third of the rig. You will notice that I use a long hook length. Again, I think that's a bit different to a lot of people, and also for the most part I like to tie my hooks and hook lengths on the bank, so I can tailor everything perfectly to the situation in terms of the bait I'm using and the swim that I'm faced with. And I don't use a loop to loop, I use a figure of 8 knot to join the main line to the hook length. I think it's a very, very subtle knot. You can hardly see the knot. It doesn't affect the fall of the bait, which is obviously so critical when you're fishing on the drop like this. So that's the 2 types of shotting pattern that I tend to use when I'm hemp fishing. Another one that I like to do if I'm fishing with bread punch, which is a real favourite bait of mine, is to make the dropper more positive. So I'm utilising the same rig, and I'm going to pull those 3 number 8 or number 7 styles together to make a double bulk. So what that's doing is it's helping me get the buoyant bait, which is bread punch, down and registering the bites efficiently. It's also a good tactic if you're getting bothered by little fish like bleak or small dace, to even make a finesse rig like this a bit more positive. But this is a rig that I simply would be lost without for the majority of my river fishing and pole fishing on rivers. Hook wise, I absolutely love the Drennan Fine Match. So they match up perfectly with the hook lengths I talked about, so from 0.06mm up to 0.09 typically, and I like to use them from size 20 down to 18 and even a size 16, just depending on the stamp of the fish and the baits that I'm using. Baits like bread punch I can get away with an 18 or a 16. If I'm fishing pinkies or single maggot, then I will go down to a 22. And for me, these are a true size hook. So a lot of the hooks on the market now are quite big for their given size. And it's also a hook that I can use with all the baits I use and target fish like from roach, dace to perch and chub. Absolutely brilliant. So that's the finesse up in the water type rig and utilising the edge tackle natural #1 float. Next up in my selection of river pole floats is the Edge Tackle N2 series, and this is a bigger brother really in terms of the tip diameter than the N1. So the body shape's the same and we've got the same titanium stem, but the actual tip is a 1.5mm plastic tip. And for me, I use these in a very similar situation as the M1, where I'm going to be fishing typically up in the water or on the drop, but I'm using slightly bigger baits, slightly heavier hooks and hook lengths. So like the M1 series, the N2 is from a 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 and 0.5. And again, extremely versatile for a great number of rivers around the country, and also when you're targeting different species. So I've set up another rig here on my CP2000. Again, it's a top 5, but I've stepped up the main line. In this case, I've used a 0.12mm premium mono. I will have some of these rigs on an 0.14 as well when I'm fishing for bigger fish and using even bigger hook lengths and hooks. But for the most part, I use an 0.12 main line. And again, I've shotted this up with styles. And just to give you a contrast to the 0.2 float that I looked at before, this is a 0.4 version. So I'd use this in deeper pegs, perhaps pegs over 3 foot deep, and when I'm faced with more flow. So I can increase the capacity of the float and the weight of the styles. In this situation, I've used number 11 styles to shot the majority of the float. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 number 9s, sorry, number 11s, and then I've got 4 number 9s. And as you can see, I've got the spread bulk shotting pattern with some styles, 4 styles below it, but I could spread that out, or I could spread out the styles in the bottom third of the rig. Basically, so many different permutations like with the N1 rig. Thought it was interesting to mention now about the titanium stem that we're using on both these series of floats. Titanium's a great kind of, don't want to say compromise, but it's a great material in terms of the fact that you've got the stability, a bit like wire, not quite as heavy as wire, so it's not prone to tangling as much as wire, but you can bend it without the fear of distorting it like with wire as well, and it fits nicely between carbon. So for me, on these sort of finesse on the drop floats, I love using this type of titanium stem, and that was something that Richard had a big involvement with. I talked about the tip being thicker. It's also useful, apart from when you're fishing with bigger baits, to be able to see it. A lot of the time on rivers, particularly rivers like the Trent, you've got like a dappled effect. It's hard to see your float, and with the slightly thicker 1.5mm diameter. You can just see it. Obviously you can still dot the float right down. Many cases when I'm using a pole float on rivers, I slightly overshot the rig anyway, just to enable me to ease the float through in a perfect way. And that's something that I would do on both these types of rigs, just by simply adding a couple more styles to the rig, just to slightly overshot it and really enhance that presentation, where I can slightly hang on and lift the float as it's going down the peg. In this situation I've used the same 3 to 4 elastic, but I also like the heavier 4 to 6 elastic when I'm using some bigger hooks and bigger hook lengths. I should reference the hook length. For the most part on this float, when I'm using an 012 or an 014 millimeter mainline, I'll use hook lengths from 0.9 up to 0.12. So just depending on the situation, I might go for fluorocarbon or premium mono. I do like using fluorocarbon when I'm fishing in clear water. It's just sort of enhancing the fact that I'm fishing slightly heavier with this rig, so I'm catching perhaps bigger fish quicker, and also encountering odd bonus fish like big perch or big chub. So it's surprising what you can land when you're fishing with balanced tackle in terms of landing bigger fish. On the 08 sort of 09 territory, I still use the fine match hooks, more sort of size 18s and 16s than 20s and 22s, and I also really favour the carbon match pattern with this type of rig and these types of hook lengths, from a size 20 down to an 18 or even a 16, depending on the bait. So for the most part in this situation I'll be using hempen tears still, but maggots and casters, maybe double maggot, double caster, just stepping everything up to be as efficient as I can in terms of catching the fish quickly and, as I mentioned, landing any bonus fish. So that's my kind of stepped up on the drop and up in the water type of pole rig, utilising the fantastic N2 series of edge tackle floats. So the next series of pole floats I like to use on rivers is the edge tackle N3 series. This is a kind of pencil type float. So as you can see, it's a very slim design. It's got a long tapered balsa body with a very short stainless steel stem and a 1.2 millimeter plastic tip, available in yellow and orange, but I'm pretty much use yellow all the time, so I haven't got any orange with me on this series. But these floats are absolutely great for a number of different situations, particularly when you're targeting fish on rivers that are slower moving and a little bit deeper. It's a great float for when you're fishing with a long pole, short line, and also when you're fishing with a whip to hand. The nature of the float, it's a very efficient float for catching fish quickly, typically when you're using a bulk like an olivette or a bulk of shot. And the nature of the float means that it's a float that you're not going to be able to hold back hard to present a bait near the bottom. It's a float that you're going to present into the peg, into the swim, get it down to where the fish are feeding and get a bite and benefit from the fact that they've got a lovely streamlined shape which exits the water very cleanly when you're striking. So it's kind of a positive float in terms of catching a lot of fish quickly. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're big fish, could be small fish like little roach and gudgeon and small perch, but again, you know, you're going to probably encounter some bonus fish as well. It's just a really interesting float to set up in a lot of different situations. So this range we've got from a half a gram up to 2 gram. So we've got 5 different sizes there, all perfectly designed for each capacity. And the float that I've set up today, I've actually set it up on my 6 meter CP 200 whip, and I've set it up with an olivette type shotting pattern. So I'll just talk about that and then we'll talk about the actual components of the rig. So in this situation, I've set up a 1.5 gram float and I've got a 1.25 Olivet, which is enabling me to add some shot to the rig to get it up to the 1.5 gram capacity. So what I've actually got is I've actually shotted these up with number 9 shot. So I've got one number 9 either side of the Olivet, and then I've got 3 down the line to play with. So it's not a type of float in this configuration where I'm going to be spreading shot out and fishing on the drop. I much prefer the N1 and N2 style of float for that, as I previously discussed. But the nice thing with this is I can play about with the dropper shot. So in this situation I've got a nice drop in the bottom sort of 2 foot, you know, 30 to 50 centimeters, where I'm going to get a drop of the number 9 shot. It's quite positive, so I'll be able to register that. It's going to get the bait down quite quickly, but I can still, if needed, pull the bulk up, spread those shot out to give us a nicer fall of the hook bait through the water once the Olivet has settled. Another great shotting pattern is the double bulk. In that case, I'm just going to pull these 3 number 9s down, and again I'm going to separate them slightly. So I've got that classic double bulk situation where you can really read and register the bites when the fish are feeding confidently, or if you're targeting smaller fish and you need a more positive type of bite registration. Using a slightly shorter hook length on this rig than I was on the other 2 rigs where I was fishing on the drop, and typically I'd be using between about 10 centimeters to 15 centimeter hook lengths with this type of rig, and I have used a loop to loop method of joining the hook length to the main line, because if I'm changing the hook, catching a lot of fish, need to change the hook, I'm not eating into my main line doing the figure of 8 knot that I used on the other 2 rigs. So on the whip, elastic wise, you can see I've elasticated the number 2 and part of the number 1. I've actually cut the flick tip off below the splice, so I've got that stub there of number 1, and I've got the elastic through the number 2 as well. And in this case, this is the edge tackle 4 to 6 elastic. Brilliant elastic to use in the whip. Obviously gives you the nice bit of cushion. You got the action of the pole as well. So again, it's surprising what fish you can land if you hook a bonus fish like a bream or a chub or a big perch or even an eel on this type of rig with a lighter hook length and a smaller hook. So the main line for this float, for most of the time I use the 012 premium mono. Enables me to use a variety of hook lengths from right down to 0.6mm up to about 0.95 in both fluorocarbon and in premium mono. Like I say, it's quite a positive rig, and similar for the hooks really. Just love the fine matching from 22 down to about 18, depending on the baits. But if I was fishing a heavier hook length, then I probably would go for the carbon match, just depending on the stamp of the fish and the venue that I'm fishing. So this rig is, as I mentioned at the start, equally useful when you're fishing on a long pole with a short line or on a whip. But for me, this is my kind of go-to float when I'm fishing a whip and I'm targeting a slower river, perhaps like deeper sections of the Warwickshire Avon, the Bristol Avon, the Don, that type of venue. Not too affected by fast water and perhaps not too affected by the wind. So that's another tremendously versatile float, and one that I use in lots of river situations. Moving on to the next river pole float in our series, and this is a wire stem float with a sort of inverted pear shape, and this is a really important and versatile float that I use for a lot of river fishing situations. You'll notice that it has got a wire stem throughout the range, and we've got a nice fine 1mm plastic bristle. Size wise, we've got from 0.4 of a gram up to 2 gram, and that really caters for most situations where I'm fishing with a bulk, either a bulk of shot or an olivette, and I'm fishing with some finesse. Perhaps I'm fishing in deeper water, or I'm trying to target fish on the bottom. Perhaps they're more in the winter when it's colder and the fish aren't feeding up in the water, or I want to get down on the bottom and target some bigger fish, perhaps feeding near the bottom. But for the most part, this type of float I'm using for smaller silverfish like roach and dace and perch, maybe skimmers and odd bonus fish. So it's not really a float that I use for catching big weights of fish, but it's a really key float for fishing a variety of river venues. One thing I should reference about this float and all the floats in the range is the key position of the eye. It's really important that the eye is situated as high up the float body as possible. So all of the floats in our range, you can notice that we've got a nice small eye, a neat eye, that's situated right near the top, the junction between the body and the tip. And I think for river fishing, that's a really key factor, enabling you to control the float perfectly. If the eye is situated further down the float, you can get a situation where the float is riding up all the time as you're controlling the float through your peg. So that's a really key fact. I also want to mention about the wire stem. Don't tend to use a wire stem float when I'm fishing with a whip. Tend to prefer the titanium or carbon type stems in that situation. But a wire stem in a certain situation, when you're trying to achieve that really nice presentation, when you've got the bait near the bottom with a bulk rig, the wire stem really helps with stability. There's something about it just being able to ease the float through, tempt a bite on a harder day, and I definitely want to go for a wire stem in this situation. So on the rig today, I've set up another top 5 rig. In this case, I've gone with a spread bulk of shot. Now, a lot of the time with this type of float, I'll use an olivette, but when I'm fishing with rigs perhaps a gram or less, I do like to use a bulk of shot like that with a spread shot situation. And in this case, these are number 9 shot. I've set up a 1 gram version of the float. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 number 9 shot. Now it's a bit of a faff. You could just use bigger shot like 4s or number 1s. But what this is achieving, it's achieving a really nice type of presentation. You get in the bulk situation where you're getting the bait down quickly, but you're also perhaps providing less resistance than you would with an olivette or with bigger shot, because the bulk is spread out over a longer area. So in that situation, it's spread out over about 5 centimeters. So I've got that spread shot of number 9 shot, and then below that I've got 3 number 10s. So the great thing with that is I can play about a little bit like the previous rig, where I can create a double bulk if I want by employing those 3 number 10s together. Or if I wanted to, I could, on a harder day, I could play about with these shot and maybe spread them out further apart. So let's try it in this case, sort of spreading them out about 3 centimeters apart. So what I'm actually doing there is I'm getting the bulk of the weight down in the bottom third of the rig, but I'm achieving a really nice presentation. Not necessarily on the drop, but one that's going to get the bait down quickly and present the bait very naturally. So that's another type of shotting pattern that I really like, that this spread bulk with shot enables me to achieve. So obviously I could use an olivette as well in this situation, and certainly if I was fishing over a gram, so if I was using the 1.5 or the 2 gram float, I tend to match that up with an Olivet. So just talking about the shape of the float. Now a lot of people might think that that's not a great shape for fishing on a river. It's not got the body up, which I think a lot of people think is necessary for fishing on a river. But I think, like a lot of people, a lot of river anglers, we've realised that having a more gentle taper at the top of the float helps to reduce the resistance of the float when you strike, especially if you're catching smaller fish, but actually also helps to achieve a really nice type of presentation. Enables you to hold onto the float and ease it through the peg, but doesn't create that big resistance when you strike, like as if it was a body up float. So I mentioned the nature of this float is fishing finesse, so smaller hooks, lighter hook lengths, but when you're fishing with a positive rig in terms of that bulk, and that's highlighting the use of this 1mm tip, such a sensitive tip, enabling you to read bites. So if you're watching the float settle as the bulk and the droppers settle down in your peg, or if you're getting very slight bites off shy fish, particularly when it's colder, you can register the bites. So it's a great combination, that of the 1mm plastic tip and that lovely 1.5mm stable wire stem. So mainline wise, I nearly always just use a 0.12mm premium mono, or in the smaller sizes when I'm fishing really light hook lengths, I might go down to 0.10mm mainline. I don't tend to really make these rigs in heavier main lines because I'm not going to be using them with bigger hooks and typically bigger hook lengths, and I'm not going to be using them on a whip like I mentioned when I'm catching lots of fish quickly, because that's where a wire stem can fall down in terms of cartwheeling through the air and kind of fighting the bolt when you're swinging a whip rig out. But as I mentioned, it's a type of float pattern that I'd really be lost without for fishing many types of river situation, slightly deeper pegs, slightly slower water, but for the bulk of my river fishing I nearly always have this type of float pattern set up. Elastic wise, on this I'm using the 4-6 hybrid edge tackle elastic, but obviously if I was fishing finer hook lengths I'd probably go down to the 3-4 just to match up with the finer hooks and finer hook lengths. And just to mention the actual length of line that I'm using, I nearly make up all my rigs on a top 5 like this. I might decide if I'm fishing in a not such a deep peg and I'm really fishing in a tight area, perhaps I'm fishing over ground bait, I might shorten my main line down to a top 4 with this type of float. For the most part, with the N1 and N2 floats, I like to be using a long line like I mentioned, because I'll be actively fishing the float and getting the bait up in the water, fishing on the drop. This situation I might be fishing with a shorter line if I need to really control my float over a smaller area. And obviously that goes for bloodworm fishing as well. If you're using baits like bloodworm, you need to be controlling it over a tighter area than you are when you're loose feeding. So that's the fantastic N4 pattern, and one that I'd simply be lost without. So in conjunction with this N4 type of float pattern, again I'm fishing with some finesse, so the fine match for me, it's just a firm favourite. Enables me to fish with smaller baits, lighter baits like bloodworm, also baits like maggots and casters. If I was fishing perhaps a little bit heavier hook length, I might switch over to the carbon match, again a hook that I've referenced before, one that I really like when I'm fishing for perhaps a bigger stamp fish on slightly heavier hook lengths like 0.9 and 0.10. Moving on to the next pole float series that I like to use on rivers, and this is more of a pronounced type body, still got more of a taper on the top than the bottom, but this kind of float is enabling you to control and hold back the float more than the other floats that we've looked at so far. You'll see that they're designed with a carbon stem and a good diameter hollow tip. So this type of float, no surprise I suppose, is when you want to use heavier line, heavier hooks, targeting bigger fish or catching a lot of fish very quickly. Again, it's a float that can be used on a whip or on a long pole with a short line. And for edge tackle, this is our N5 series of floats. We've got 6 floats in the range. We got from a 0.5 up to a 3 gram. So it's covering a multitude of situations, a multitude of depths, and also pace. Obviously, the deeper you go on a river, so perhaps over 8-10 foot, you're going to start utilizing the bigger 2 and 3 gram floats. Depths between 3 and 6-7 foot, obviously you can use the different capacities, the lighter floats, and also if the flow is stronger, you need to use a heavier float. So this is a really versatile series of floats, great for fishing bigger baits and targeting bigger fish. So a step up really in terms of the N4 float. And the carbon stem's great, as I mentioned. It's something that you can use on a whip as well as a running short line, long pole. And I've actually set these up today on my CP1000 Top 5 kit. The version that I've gone for here is a 2 gram float. Just thought I'd mention something about the rubbers that I'm using. You'll see that I've got 3 rubbers. So for most of my pole floats, irrespective of whether I'm fishing on a still water or a river, I like to use 3 rubbers. One situated on the bottom that's a bit longer to help prevent the line from wrapping around the bottom of the float, one in the middle, and one underneath the body. And obviously if I'm going to change the depth drastically, I like to pull that top rubber down to enable the line to move over the more pronounced body in this case. But as Richard mentioned in the actual product video, this paint is very, very robust and tough, and you don't tend to get the line digging into the float and causing float leakage. One thing that you'll see is we've gone for the coil type ring on these floats. Again, just to sort of balance with the heavier line, the fact that you're going to be catching bigger fish or a lot of fish just makes the construction of the float a lot stronger. So in keeping with that, the main line I've used on this rig is 016 premium mono, and on some of these rigs I might use up to even 020 millimeter. So where I'm fishing whips to hand for big weights of fish like on the River Wye, I'll often use a 020 main line. On the smaller floats probably 016, but somewhere between there, just to marry up with the right stamp of fish in terms of the hook lengths and hooks that you're using. So I'd be using probably 012 hook lengths up to 016 hook lengths. You can see I do really like the fluorocarbon, the Edge Pure fluorocarbon for my hook lengths. Find it very tough and robust, really good for when you're catching lots of fish. So back to this rig. Most of the time I'm going to be employing a bulk and I'm going to be employing an Olivet. So in this case, for this 2 gram float, I've got a 1.75 gram float, and I'm using number 9 shot to trap it and number 9 shot down the line. So the Olivet's allowing me to get the bait down quickly to the feeding fish, or if I'm fishing a more powerful or deeper river peg, I've still got the flexibility to play about. In this situation I've got the opportunity to bring down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 number 9 shot. So I can make that great double bulk shotting pattern that I keep going on about. In this case 4 number 9s to make a really positive dropper and play about with the position of the olivette. One thing to mention at this point is you really want to make sure that your hook length is always shorter than the distance between the bottom dropper, or in this case a double bulk, and the main bulk, just to help prevent tangles. And you really want to try and get in the habit of laying your rig in, even if you're catching lots of fish really quickly. Just laying your rig in so that everything is straight and it's preventing any tangles on the way down. Sometimes you try and go too quickly and you come back and you find out that the hook is around the bulk. So just bear that in mind. Obviously, even though this is a positive rig, you can make it have a bit more finesse by pulling the bulk up and spreading those dropper shot out. So sometimes even when you're fishing for bigger fish like bream or perch, chub, when you're catching them near the bottom or even over depth, just by increasing that drop from the hook to the bulk, you can fool some wary fish by just getting a really nice drop of the bait as it starts to get down to the bottom. I think that's particularly the case when you're easing the float through the peg, or also where you're fishing over depth and blocking the float and holding it. And this type of float is the type of float that's perfect for that. In all but the most powerful conditions, you'll be able to select a float that's going to hold in the flow and present the bait over depth on the bottom very nicely. And that's something that this thicker tip enables you to do, and also use bigger baits like bigger worms, even half a lobworm, or bunches of maggots and double caster, treble caster, bigger baits. The more buoyant tip's going to enable you to fish those baits effectively without it constantly dragging under. Again, I referenced it before, but a lot of the time I will overshot my river floats, and I just do that by adding some more number 9 shot, almost like trim shot, to the bulk, so that it's nice and neat. I'm not putting the trim shot somewhere else that's going to cause tangles potentially if I'm trying to catch quickly. But just overshotting the float really does help get bites on a harder day, and basically something that I pretty much always do when I'm river fishing. So hook wise, hook lengths, obviously we're going to increase the hook lengths, be fishing 0.10, even 0.15, 0.16 with stronger hooks. With the 0.12, I really like the carbon match in the bigger sizes. Used down to a 14 quite a lot on the Y when I'm fishing for dace and roach. If you're starting to catch some bigger fish like chub, big perch, I do like the Camazan B711 from perhaps as big as a size 11 if I'm using bits of worm, up to perhaps a 17 when I'm fishing for dace on double maggot on the Y. But obviously I'm fishing with heavier main line, heavy hook lengths, so I need to increase the strength of the hook to balance my tackle perfectly. Elastic wise, on the N5 range of floats, I tend to go for something heavier like a 6 to 8 solid elastic. Obviously enables me to fish with the heavier hooks, heavier lines, and land the fish really quickly and efficiently. If I'm fishing the whip, the CP 200 whip, then I'll often take out the tip and elasticate that with a 10 to 12 elastic. Really gives, you only need a short length just through the number 2 section, gives that initial cushion on the strike but enables you to swing in the fish very quickly and efficiently. So I'd be typically using a 6 to 8 up to a 10 to 12 elastic with this type of float. So that's the N5 range of edge tackle floats, absolutely tailor-made for many river float, pole float situations. So in the series of river pole floats, this is the final pattern. As I mentioned, I like to consolidate my floats down, and this type of float takes over really when I'm fishing deeper, even more powerful pegs like you find on the River Y or the River trend in certain areas like the tidal trend or on the River Severn. So this is the edge tackle, and this is the N6 series of floats. We've got 4 floats from 2 gram, 3 gram, 4 and 5. And as I said, this is where I'm going to be fishing with heavier floats, bigger olivettes, and fishing for bigger fish. A great feature about these floats is the fact that we've got the line going through the body. So when you're using thicker lines like 0.20mm main lines, you're not cutting into the body of the float when you're catching lots of fish and when you're changing the depth. Again, you've got that really key position of the eye very near the top of the body to enable perfect control when you're fishing with a pole float on a river. You've got a very sturdy carbon stem and a nice thick hollow tip. So a little bit like the N5, this is a type of float where you're going to be catching either bigger fish or fish very quickly, and you're using heavier gear. So same as the previous float, main lines up to 0.20. I don't really ever go over 0.20 main line. 0.16 as well when you're fishing on the finer or sort of lighter side of this heavier type of float. And I've set up here, this is a rig that I've actually used a few times on the Trent recently, and this is a 4 gram version of the N6. You can see there, actually interestingly, I've put a piece of silicone over the tip of the float to black it out, obviously just to save blacking the yellow float out. It's quite a nice tip, that, just pushing some silicone on the tip. You can either thicken the tip by doing that if you can't quite see your float, or change the colour, in this case from yellow to black. And again, this is set up on the top 5. This is actually our CP800 pole, and I'll set that up on the top 5. So it's a stronger pole to sort of match with the heavier floats and heavier line that I'm using. It's also a rig that you could use on the whip, on the CP200 whip, and one that I use a lot on rivers like the Wye when you're fishing to hand and catching lots of fish very quickly. Elastic wise, you're going to be using obviously heavier elastics, the 10 to 12 solid, even the 12 to 14. So you're upping the ante with the elastic in keeping with the size of the float and the size of the hooks and the line that you're using. Same type of shotting pattern as the N5. Predominantly I'm using an olivette. They're too big really for using shot bulks. So in this case I've got a 3.75 olivette. I've actually used number 6 shots on this to trap the olivette and as droppers. Same scenario, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 number 6s below, so I can create that double bulk if I want, or I can push the bulk up and spread the shot out. So very simple shotting patterns, and shotting patterns that really work when you're being very positive in nature, like this type of float and this type of rig requires. So hook length wise, same as the N5, up to 0.16 and down to about 0.14. Again, it's a float that you can use when you're fishing on a whip and you're running the float through, perhaps overshotting it slightly to give the best presentation, or you're absolutely blocking it and holding it still, laying on, maybe fishing for bream, perch, eels. This heavier type of float is going to enable you to do that in some quite strong and deep pegs. So that's the final sort of pattern really. Hook wise, same story, B711s in the bigger sizes. I do really like this Sensus hook. It's a 3180 BZ in the bigger sizes, particularly if I'm fishing for bream. I really like that hook. If I'm fishing more for chub, then I tend to go for the B711s. But obviously stronger hooks in keeping with the stronger hook lengths and bigger floats, bigger fish. So that concludes the video on pole float fishing on rivers. I hope that the rigs that we've shown, including the floats, the line, the hooks and the shotting patterns, have helped you when you go out river fishing. All of these products are available on the Edge website, so check it out, and also check out the poles on our Cadence website. Thanks for watching.